Welcome, Pooja. Thank you so much for joining me on the Future of Funding podcast. We go back a long way, so I'm genuinely pleased and honored to have you as part of the first round. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. Can I pass it across to you to introduce yourself and Arpan and tell us about something exciting that you are working on this year?
Thanks so much, Rizwan, for inviting me on this podcast. I'm really excited to be here and so glad to be able to share my thoughts on so many different aspects that the nonprofits experience while we continue to do our very important work. Arpan's mission is to prevent child sexual abuse and heal those affected by it. It's been a journey of close to 19 years for me since the time I started to work on the issue, and a very heartening one. I've learned a lot along the way. Arpan is very quickly moving towards scaling solutions and testing its efficacy to be able to give a highly scalable solution to the world so that we can prevent child sexual abuse and support appropriately when a child goes through it. We're doing it in two very prominent ways. One, by building capacities of teachers to teach children personal safety skills so that children can recognize safe and unsafe situations and touches and seek help in a timely manner so that abuse doesn't happen. And through that, we're also enabling teachers to handle disclosures appropriately. Parallelly, we're also working through systems and policy work to be able to integrate personal safety education curriculum into school curriculum so that it becomes a regular curriculum that is taught by teachers alongside. So we understand that a one-time training is not going to be enough. A one-time teaching children personal safety is not going to be enough. It's something we need to do repeatedly to enhance socio-emotional well-being of children so that children thrive in their childhoods.
Thank you very much. And we go back, like I said, a long while. So it's been amazing to see the trajectory and the growth. In this case, it's not so much the impressiveness of the growth in terms of the team size, but certainly in terms of value and the depth of impact and how far you've taken Arpan and how far Arpan has got to in terms of now being able to consider all of the factors that impact child sexual abuse. And that's, for me, is particularly exciting to be a part of that journey because all our missions are really to do things that transform lives and outcomes for people. We can meaningfully demonstrate that it's an issue that can be reduced and eradicated. I think that'll be a game changer for the world.
Absolutely. And so glad to have you as a co-traveler on this journey. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. So this, I guess, it's very interesting because you said 19 years. And I think over that time, you will have experienced all the ups and downs of funding in many ways. So I think you'd be a great person to not just to hear experiences from, but also to learn from in terms of what funding should look like for nonprofits to really be able to achieve powerful outcomes for vulnerable demographics. But I'd like to start with some of the experiences that you found to be powerful and enabling through your career. So this is not so much in terms of the fundraising journey, but certainly taking into account application processes, selection processes, the way money has been awarded, the continuity of money, how funders have engaged with you during the funding time cycle. So maybe we could start there and see if there's anything we can learn in terms of what you've thought have been the best practices that have really helped you all move forward and helped you feel great as a team.
I feel like whenever funders have come in to give unrestricted, trust-based funding, it's been a great enabler. It's important that while nonprofits are held accountable and they put in the reports, if it was just one annual report we sent out to all our funders, it would be amazing rather than curating for every single bit of funding. What did we do with that money? With every single detail of the line item which we spent money, how much did we use, how much is unspent. I think that kind of requirement and expectation puts a huge burden on the finance team, the fundraising team. If we had the flexibility to use it the way we thought best, that would be brilliant.
Has there been examples that you can provide where you had the flexibility and what effect that's had? And secondly, where any funder has in fact accepted an annual report as a fair report?
And we've had examples of all of these. So we have funders who are giving unrestricted funding, trust-based, and they have accepted only the annual report as a report. They are largely philanthropists.
What's been the biggest fund size that was willing to accept an annual report?
Well, the most recent example was MacKenzie Scott. So they gave a large sum of money without any expectation of actually any report. So not just the annual report, but no report. And they left it to us to use the money the way we wanted to. And then we got other funders who for many years have been supporting us, and they are absolutely all right with us giving them just the annual report.
So when you say large sum of money, the reason I asked the question is I think for other funders, it might be interesting to understand where these practices are. So when we say large sum of money, are we talking about less than $100,000, over $100,000?
We got 3 million from MacKenzie Scott.
See, that's a very powerful statement there because we're not talking about small amounts of money. We're talking about large amount of money. What was the diligence process, or how did they get to that place where they were comfortable? Is that their standard practice?
It's their standard practice. They work through an intermediary agency to do the diligence, understand the needs of the organization. They have certain criteria for the kind of organizations they give the money to. I think we were very aligned to that. And the diligence process, I think, built the confidence for them to go invest in us.
When they did that diligence process, were they primarily looking at your financial controls? What type of diligence process was it that got to that place?
Everything. So it was a simple proposal. Who have been our past funders? What is our 3-year plan? What are we going to do in those 3 years? What kind of budgets are we looking for? How much confidence do we have to raise? What part of it? What are the gaps that are there in the budget, in the funding that we want to raise? Those kind of things. And there were a number of conversations with the diligence partner on trying to understand it from us. It was not just a written proposal, but a number of conversations on hearing from us firsthand.
And when you say us, who's us? Yourself?
It was me and the fundraising director at Arpan.
So that diligence was with you as a CEO and then the fundraising director. So that's interesting, right? Because they've effectively evaluated where you're going and whether that's compelling rather than actually evaluating, let's say, team competence or enterprise capability. Because if they've only spoken to 2 people or they're not looked at your systems, that's also a powerful statement of trust, right? That means they must have been focusing on whether or not they believe in you as a leader and whether your enterprise has a track record that they can be confident in. And then once they've done that, they've been willing to put in a significant commitment. Is that a commitment you asked for? Or is that what they determined was a sensible amount of money for your enterprise?
They determined.
Interesting. And did they tell you what the basis of that determination was?
Not really.
I think that's fascinating because this is a good example for funders in general.
I think it's a great example for funders. I wish everybody turned into a MacKenzie Scott approach towards funding organizations. It would be brilliant because it just gives you so much confidence, validation for your work, the ability to go make investments in things that weren't getting funded. It helped build resilience in the organization by putting some amounts of it in a reserve fund. More than anything, it helps you think big. That's what entrepreneurs need, the ability to take risks, to make big bets, to think big dreams, that yes, we can go do this.
And what did you do with that money? What new thing or what changing thing that allow you to do as an enterprise?
My ability to make decisions around funding support functions in the organization, help build our tech capabilities, help onboard consultants to help us strategize, think better, become more proficient in the work that we're doing, be able to grow our communications, which is usually not funded. So to be able to strengthen our communications vertical as well. A number of things. It helped build our reserve fund as well. And for an issue like child sexual abuse, where it's in any case very hard to raise money, and then to be able to build a decent size of reserve fund has been an absolute game changer for me.
Right. In terms of stress, in terms of operations.
Both ways.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Because there's a typical assumption that if organizations and leaders are given latitude to what they can do with money, then they will somehow squander it. And if you listen to the examples you've provided, that's entirely the opposite in real life, right? It gets put towards the thing that it should get put to without you having to worry whether people will agree or accept. I think that's a big limiting factor, right? When you are concerned that enterprises or funders will not accept something, that there's a tendency to not proceed down that line because there's always that tricky balance of antagonizing funders by suggesting things that you are already not sure that they might accept. And especially how you've used it is actually a lesson for funders in general, which is the amount of money has to be big enough to be usable, but also the fact that once that's provided, nonprofit leaders and organizations will use that money to, in fact, improve their overall operational stability capability. I think that's a beacon example.
The next thing that I'd like to talk about is the flexibility to use the funding for capacity building. And also, there have been trusts and foundations who have specifically funded capacity building needs of the organization. That's been very, very useful for Arpan. At our early stages of growth, we had funders supporting our capacity building needs. So somebody was willing to pay for the salary of a fundraising director or the first person in the communications team or build out a research and M&E team. Having funders support those needs, even content curriculum work that is very important at Arpan, has been a very important part of our ability to deliver on our commitments. The other piece I would say is because we've had long-term co-travelers, it's been amazing for us because for an entrepreneur to have the backing of people who are with you on this journey and knowing that they are there for more than 5 years, 10 years, it just gives you again a huge psychological support that you can go and grow and dream big because there are a bunch of people who are with you on this journey. So funders who come in for 1 or 2 years or for 3 years max, vis-a-vis funders who fund you for 5 years, 10 years, there's a huge difference in the confidence and ability that you have to go do the work that you've set out to.
That's a really good point again we should definitely stop and talk about, which is that 3 years is still seen as a long funding timeline. 3 years, it's very short. So you're saying that it's really when it starts getting into the 5 and 10 year or 10 year plus that you've really got long-term funding. The impact of that on teams and leaders is high because you really feel appreciated and trusted and supported. And I'm sure that stability also massively enables you to keep operating properly.
I'm not worried about very minimum cash flows. I'm worried about the differential cash flow for growth. But the minimum cash flow, I'm not worried about to be able to operate at a certain level. And that's huge. The other thing I'd also advise and make suggestions to funders as well is that the ability for an entrepreneur to put in their everything becomes high the minute you say there is a probability that we will fund you for the next 10 years. And just saying that aloud, I think is very important. If you tell somebody that, look, we usually fund organizations and support entrepreneurs for a 10-year horizon, it's like bull's eye. That's a sweet spot that entrepreneurs want to be in when you have a bunch of such kind of funders.
Have you found a number of those or just the one? Who does that well?
We found a number of those, thankfully.
Did they start off with the intention to be long-term backers or did they become long-term backers over time?
I think all of them actually started their philanthropic journey almost at the same time that Arpan was starting out. Their thinking has also evolved over a period of time. I don't think any of them said in the beginning that we will fund you for 10 years, but they saw the need to do so to be able to make impact that they understand as impact. They were also able to see that Arpan was delivering on its commitments. It has been able to do impactful work for the mission that we exist to fulfill. So I think that makes a huge difference for people to continue on that journey as well.
Do you see a relationship or a correlation between funders who've done that trust-based, unrestricted money and the long-term support, or is it equivalent either way?
We've seen restricted funds come in year after year as well, especially from corporations. We had corporations funding us for over 5 years, which I think is huge, considering they make only 1-year commitments. But the fact that some corporations have continued to fund us over 5 years is very heartening, actually.
But if you look at those 10-year ones, are they mostly trust-based and unrestricted?
Yes.
That's what I meant by it's an interesting relationship there, right? Like you're coming in with a trust-based lens in many ways. What's really interesting, there is a concept called trust-based philanthropy, but it's not in fact this at all. Trust-based philanthropy in its actual operation is really, let's say, community voice-based, or is really about reducing the power dynamics between funders, nonprofits, and communities. But I feel that's a shame in many ways because funding should be trust-based, which is funder trusts nonprofit and nonprofit is able to trust funder. That's currently not what trust-based funding has been defined as, which is for me certainly one of the gaps in how the sector has developed, that we've taken a term that is actually highly critical for impact success and then co-opted it for a slightly different use, if that makes sense. That was interesting for me, certainly when I started off with Fractal, because I wanted to support trust-based philanthropy or giving in the way that you're talking about it now, which is essentially that you do powerful due diligences, and then that essentially should establish a powerful understanding between funder and nonprofit in context of community and impact. And then essentially allow the funder to relax into the provision of money that then trusts the nonprofit enterprise and leadership, etc., to utilize that money to best impact effective, with agreements and commitments around impact. Unfortunately, it turned out that it's not quite what trust-based philanthropy is. But this conversation really brings that home to me, because we can just see the power and value of a funder that takes the time to establish that trust. Maybe one thing I can also follow up on that with you is, in terms of the trusted relationships you have, how many of them have really been between the decision makers of the funders and you as a person? And how many of them have been because those funding enterprises really understood your enterprise and were able to trust the enterprises?
I think there are examples of both, but the latter is more often. They're really able to understand the needs, and they spend the time to understand what the needs are, how can they be helpful.
Maybe give me a good example of that. What would be your best example of a funder that took the time to really understand what Arpan does and how they did that?
Just by having more conversations. There are many examples of trusts and foundations, and there are many examples of philanthropists as well who genuinely care. And follow on point I want to make from that is that when COVID hit, they got it that we would be under stress. And many of them were supportive by sending emails or messages saying, we're here. If there's anything that you need, reach out to us. One of the foundations was so thoughtful that they sent out an additional small grant for us to use for the well-being of employees, which I thought was really nice. That was so caring, and I felt very heartened by that action. So some of them even go that extra mile, which I think is beautiful to see.
That's interesting. Any other good practices that have stood out for you over your career? So far, you've talked about trust, essentially money provided with trust, money provided unrestricted, organizations being willing to accept single annual reports. And ideally, this would happen across the board, but at the very least, there are some that are willing to accept the one that you've provided, where the enterprise is given full latitude to deploy that money without having to explain or be answerable necessarily for its specific use. Capacity building funds have been super helpful to you. Long-term backers with 10-year horizons, you said, have been a game changer for how you've looked at your commitment and time. Certainly the size of grants that may allow you to set up reserve funds, or the flexibility to be able to set up reserve funds that really just allow you to focus on that differential cash flow for growth rather than worrying about your daily operations in the short term. These are some of the great practices that you mentioned that have really been a game changer for you.
And the fact that the ability to take risks, think big, dream big, think scale, you need to have that minimum support to be able to go do that. The ability to do all of that has been game changing when you have trust-based funding coming your way. One more thing that I can think of is there is a difference between funders who are funding the issue vis-a-vis the funders who are betting on you as an entrepreneur. And I feel that the value is different when you're a startup organization vis-a-vis you're a mature organization.
That's a very good point.
At the startup stage, you need more of the people who can bet on you as an entrepreneur. And at the mature stage, you want people who not only want to continue to bet on you as an entrepreneur, but additionally who care about the issue as well, because they also become your ambassadors for drawing more investment. Then they are looking at you as what is the impact that you're making on the issue? How are you scaling and growing? And you want that maturity in the funders to come in eventually as well. It's also useful because then the funder is not betting on you, but you as an organization to go deliver on the impact, and they are in it for the long term. Someday, the entrepreneur might not be at the helm, but because they've transitioned what they are investing in, they would be okay for the entrepreneur to someday move on and not say, oh, but you're no longer the CEO. Now we don't know what's going to happen.
That leads back to the thing that we were talking about in terms of due diligence, you see, because I think that's a great example of it. If you're not doing a due diligence across enterprise leaders and operating teams, you can get very connected to just the leader. And that's a benefit, certainly in the early years, but there's also a limitation and a trap in the sense that then it's hard for that leader to ever be free of those funding relationships, for example, or the enterprise to feel confident in its success post that leadership. Because once that leader goes, then all the relationships go and all the trust goes and all the believability goes, because those funders were funding that leader, not necessarily trusting the enterprise's wider operating capability and impact, which is, of course, generated by everybody. That impact is not generated purely by founder or CEO. But that's a good point that you make, which is that one is best appropriate for the startup years when leaders really need to believe in themselves and to have the right kind of support and latitude to be able to get their organizations to a mature operating state. Again, I come back to what Fractal was set up. It's really to go wide. So when we do due diligences, the CEO is 1 hour or 2 hours in the conversation. Because you can get some organizations where the CEO is by far the most competent player in the whole enterprise. So if you only talk to the CEO, you have really no idea that the rest of the organization is just following.
Yeah, a number of funders ask to meet the leadership team. They engage with the leadership team to understand what the leadership team is like.
Exactly. So that's a really powerful insight. From there, I think we've got quite a lot of really good practices. So I want to move on then to the flip side. The unhelpful practices, the unhelpful behaviors, particularly focusing on the ones that have really pained you or stressed you all. I'd like to really try and draw out the ones that have really made a lasting impression on you over your 19 years of doing this and why those things left that impression.
A lot of things are coming to me as we're having this conversation. A couple of things on this. One being that at a very basic level, we'll go to conferences where there are funders, you're trying to approach people. The most common thing that I hear when I ask them for a business card is, I've run out of business cards. And basically, they just don't want you to connect with them. I feel disturbed with that because you can have a business card with just your email ID and no other contact information and allow for people to write into you at least. Because the very purpose for why you exist as a funder, I feel like there is a value mismatch. One is that. Two is that another common excuse, some are genuinely going through a strategy exercise. But when you write into a few, conversations have happened and then they'll say, but we're reviewing our strategy and we'll come back to you. For some, I feel they are genuinely going through that and figuring out what they want to invest in next, which is absolutely fine. But some you can make out as just an excuse. I would appreciate funders to be more candid to say, hey, we're not able to consider you at this moment for whatever reason, and just be transparent about it. I just feel there's no harm in being honest. Or even say that if they found something that they weren't feeling confident about, say it aloud. Hey, this is something I'm not feeling sure about. Would you like to work on this a bit more and come back in a couple of months and let's have a conversation again? Having a more empowering approach towards nonprofit leaders and organizations, which leaves us feeling that with feedback, we can work on something and come back, I think is just so much more heartening and empowering.
Valuable or sensible feedback, transparency and feedback on how you can grow. You're absolutely right. Almost any team or leadership with any sense is always happy to get inputs.
Exactly. And there are some good examples of funders who've done that, but some who keep making this excuse on strategy, exercises that we are going through internally and we will come back, was really. The other point I want to make is sometimes vis-a-vis the quantum of funding they are wanting to start off with, the kind of process we go through is humongous and the expectation is too much. Different stages that you go through, you first send in a small concept note, then they review that, then they take you through the application process. The application process can be very long, the proposal can be very long, loads and loads of details being asked. Then there are conversations. It can be just very long. And I feel when funder is willing to give big money, it makes sense. But if the quantum of funding is small, but nonprofits go through that process, I feel is a bit too much. Smaller amounts of funding can be based on their approach to taking risks a bit more rather than safeguarding every single investment that they make. Again, it leads to a trust-based philanthropy. But if you can't get there, at least you can say, I know these 3 funders who've given money to Arpan because they have, and for so many years they continue. I am all right with not doing a very detailed diligence process, but saying, look, I will do only 50% of my process because I can see these three organizations have been funding you for so many years.
And what sort of money are you talking about here?
$50,000, $100,000 for a mature organization like us. It's a small amount of money, but the kind of process and time it takes is humongous.
It's a very good point that you're making here that, again, a lot of funders, I think, don't appreciate that $100,000 is not a significant amount of money for a mature organization. It's fine for startups or small organizations. If I look at my experience, I would say organizations really hit their straps somewhere between $1.5 and $2 million operating costs. Around $2 million operating costs, you've got an enterprise that genuinely has the operating capability to make a useful, powerful impact with good potential for scale, right? This is in the global south, India, Southeast Asia, Latin and South America. Once you get to organizations that are operating, $1 million is still on the smaller end. But by the time you get to a $2 million real amount of conversion money in the local arena, now you're talking about powerful functional organizations. And in that context, $100,000 is a small amount of money in the sense that it's still at 1/20th of that overall operating cost. We're not talking about growth cost or any of the other things. I think that's a very important point because a lot of funders in the system look at $10,000 and $20,000 and $30,000 as small, $5,000 as small. Even that make a difference. Minimum amount of money we would accept from a funder that had any reporting was $50,000. That was just an annual report. Below $40,000, look, you can donate it, but there's no meaningful way for us to manage you as a funder in a operating cost aimed at $2 million or $3 million US dollars. That's a very important point that you just made.
And add-on point to that is the new thing I'm hearing is funders wanting to be catalytic, and they are wanting to be catalytic with these kind of grant sizes of $100,000, $50,000. And then the conversation is about, with this money, how can we be catalytic in your work? But with a $3 million budget, how do I build a narrative that's going to be convincing enough to say this is going to be catalytic for us? We'll come up with something, but it's in the context of the organization budget, what kind of catalytic impact can your funding really make and be more practical and reasonable about it?
What size is a catalytic? Either what size is a catalytic or what use allows it to be catalytic. And there will typically be a relationship between the two.
Exactly. The other thing is on this whole proposal thing, sometimes the questions are repetitive. I feel funders who are mature, it's important that they look at their questions in the proposals and see how can it be more succinct to be able to derive what they're really looking for, rather than try and asking the same thing in a different manner because it is repetitive.
And what effect does that have when you're having to answer it?
We struggle to think, how do we now answer this slightly differently, though the answer is actually pretty much the same what was asked 3 questions before. So we need to then spend time to be a bit more innovative, to craft the response a bit more differently so that it looks like it's a bit of a different answer. Then the other thing is this word limitation. We understand that you want succinct responses. You don't have the time to look through long responses. I still feel that the word limit should be a little more reasonable than 200 or 300 words. Some proposal, the expectation to fit it all in a very limited amount of words can become very cumbersome because we'll end up spending a lot of time in trying to reframe, reconstruct the sentence so that we manage to fit it into that word limit. Unless your question is expecting a succinct response, it's a different thing. But if it is expecting a detailed response, but you still have a very constrained word limit, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah, and as you get more mature, it's like that as well. You're doing more complex things. So it's a bit like a CV, saying, well, give me a 1-page CV. It's fine when you're 10 years out of college, you're 50 years old. You've done loads of stuff. You can collapse it. But in that collapse, we've gone well below the threshold of minimum useful information. You have no idea really what this person has done because the spacing has completely removed the potential for that visibility. I think the point you're making here, which is the takeaway for funders, is that how they construct the RFP really impacts how much time a nonprofit and its team needs to spend answering that RFP. And in that then lies a lot of cost and effort and demoralization to some extent because people are fighting hard to try and work their way through these RFPs, which you are forced into by nature of that funder nonprofit.
And to that, I've made another suggestion to some funders as well, that at the first stage itself, if you don't take us to the next stage and you say, we don't see an alignment, it's fine. But if you take us through a long process and we still don't make it, funders should think about giving us very small grant to respect the time that was put into the process. So if a process is going to be 8 months long, a year long, continuous conversations, sending files, doing diligence, or whatever that process is like, our fundraising team and the CEO has put in a lot of time. So if you can give a small grant to respect that investment of time, it leaves the nonprofit feeling very valued and respected. Because in any ways, the equation is not balanced at all, right? The power is remaining with the funder. How can funders create a more equitable relationship, empowering nonprofits to feel more equal on the table, feeling more valued and respected?
Again, I come back to how I always do these due diligences and so on. Is that you can respect that time in two ways. You can provide a financial coverage for the effort and time, or at the very least, you can ensure that that process is genuinely developmental for that organization. Everybody that goes through it learns, gets better. Even if the organization doesn't actually get money, you've changed their ability to raise money somewhere else. And there's definitely a way to do this so that all players come out of it feeling, wow, those 2 hours were super valuable, rather than just feeling like you've had the life sucked out of you in a 9-month process. And now people just turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, our strategy has changed.
And that's exactly what my next point was, that in these many years, we've had at least 2 funders who took us through the process and then said that we didn't get to the next stage because our work didn't align to their strategy. I felt that that was unfair, because you knew what is the work that we were doing from a long time ago. The alignment check on the strategy you would do at stage 1. So if our work didn't align to your strategy, why even make us go through that process? So those are experiences where I feel my team felt very disappointed and very disrespected for our time and the effort that we put in.
You feel disheartened. And I think it's very important that people also recognize that you feel disrespected, right? Someone has just used your time for no reason. And what's interesting, if you look at some enterprises and how these things are, the KPI for the grant management team can sometimes be X number of applications. Effectively, the grant management team, but the grant selection team can be incentivized to have 40 applications, of which we can shortlist 10, or we can shortlist 5. In fact, in all my career, I've always advised nonprofits at the start to be ruthless about their genuine fit. It shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be that you have to look at this and think, well, am I being put through this process so that people can tick a box that says that we got 40 good applications or 20 good applications. These are the 5 that fit us. I don't think that should happen. I recognize this, and I've always advised people, says, listen, look really carefully at what the funder's thematic areas or historical giving is. A lot of nonprofits are in that place where they feel, well, we've got to try, we need to raise money, let's give it a shot. And I do feel that this is something that should be on funders, and I fully agree with you.
And connected to that is what I've understood and experienced is every funder's understanding of what is scale is different. And that causes a lot of confusion for nonprofits, because you don't know how to communicate your work of scale to that funder. I have reached final stages of the application or the process, even for things like becoming a part of fellows and networks, and saying that we don't think that you're scaling enough. But you knew that right from the start, what's my level of scale? So if it didn't align to your definition of scale, why did you put me through this 8 months of process? So it's not just about strategy, but your understanding of scale. How do you look at that? For some funder, working with 10,000 children can be scale. For somebody, it can mean only if you're working with, let's say, 5 million children. But just be transparent enough to say that aloud right from the beginning, that, look, this is what scale means to us. Do you think your work is aligned to our understanding of scale and what we support? Because every funder has the right to invest in the kind of scale they want to. But are you communicating that clearly enough?
Do you feel from your experience of funders that they have established all of these criteria themselves before beginning?
I don't think they do. Only very mature funders who've been doing this work over a period of time. I respect that they have their own learning journeys, which is why I tend to give time and why I'm with you here today. That whatever contribution I can make towards their learning journey, their evolution, understanding from our experiences, nonprofit view would only enable them and empower them, because I believe many of them genuinely want to learn and become better at this.
There's a very important ethic here that I don't think people think about enough, which is the funder is not financially limited. So in that sense, there's a question of saying, what do you need to learn as you experiment? Is there an ethic there that says that you should have done that, invested the cost, the time, the effort to do that learning before you start pulling other people along your journey? And I think this is an ethic for nonprofits too. And I've said this to many young people entering the nonprofit space.
If I can recollect, I feel only 2 or 3 have ever run an anonymous form asking for feedback on their processes, their approach from nonprofits. I feel more of this needs to be done, that you would run anonymous surveys.
Honestly, in many ways, why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, because many will not feel comfortable to say it outright.
Absolutely.
I have begun to voice at meetings my concerns, but I do sometimes find myself keeping quiet on something.
You're disincentivized. It's not just about that particular funder taking it badly, but the effect that that funder can have then on the network of other people that they have relationships with at that funding level. So I feel it's absolutely true. And again, genuinely a reason for starting this podcast. And I've done the research recently. I can't find anything out there that openly basically is, talking to nonprofits about their views and their experiences, helpful and unhelpful. There's lots of helpful, obviously, because the people are incentivized to put out everything helpful. But this other aspect, which is that as funders, you don't realize how many unhelpful practices you're engaging in because you're not getting that feedback. And there's no meaningful way to get that in a imbalanced power dynamic wise. It's always interesting, even for me, when I encounter why and how those decisions are made. But that does really lend back to your point, which is there needs to be some consistency and some transparency. Otherwise, it is very disheartening for nonprofit leaders. And that disheartening lasts a long time. And I think people forget that nonprofit practitioners, not just leaders, are already doing a lot of work that is emotionally heavily invested. You're already dealing with other people's complex emotional challenges that have personal and emotional implications. And you have to absorb that and you have to be able to deal with that. And especially if you're dealing with something like child sexual abuse. I don't think there's also enough of that consideration.
And then you've got the venture capitalist funders. Their understanding of scale, again, is very different. So it's a challenge for nonprofits to build different kinds of narratives for different kinds of funders. We're anyway spending a lot of time packaging differently, right? It's hard. Now, you're somebody who's interested in education, you're talking about how does sexual violence affect educational outcomes. Somebody is interested in gender-based outcomes. You're talking about how does this issue affect girls? How are we tracking outcomes for girls? For every type of funder, Arpan has to think of different kinds of indicators that are going to appeal and align to their strategy of impact that they want to create as funders. It's a lot of work for us. Right now, we're in the midst of creating gender-based outcomes because we've got 2 funders who wants to see how is our work not just generically helping all children, all genders, but girls in specific. So now we need to start creating a narrative around that. It's a lot of work. It's very frustrating. And I'm not sure how much people really understand the amount of different kinds of packaging you want to do. And then we can only package it so much because I really believe that our work has always stood true for the work we do. We've never accepted funding from funders who said we want to do only girls. We said, look, for us, children are children, irrespective of what gender, and we are not going to be discriminating against any kind of group of children, irrespective of their religion, caste, sex, gender, socioeconomic strata. I remember many years ago, there was one funding website, those retail funding websites. One couldn't join because the criteria was that are you mostly working with children in poverty or children who are extremely vulnerable? And my conversation with them was, in the context of my issue, children in even high socioeconomic strata are very vulnerable. because they don't have those avenues to talk about it, because family honor is such a big thing. Who do they go and report to? So it needs to be understood from an issue specific, the vulnerability, all of those kinds of things, rather than creating criterias around gender, socioeconomic strata, religion.
That's why I always maintain that it's about eradicating poverty and vulnerability, because the minute you assume that vulnerability is purely and solely a function of poverty, you've missed a very critical point that not everything works like that. A lot of people need help and are vulnerable in non-poverty scenarios.
There's anyways a very complex scenario, because there is the whole sensationalization of what's right now exciting to fund. There was a period of many years where trafficking was getting the most money. And I kept saying, what happens to incest? Then there has been a period where, and it's still going on, where online harms, digital harms is getting a lot of investment. And I'm like, what about incest? So I'm the only person almost who's talking about what are we doing to address incestuous sexual abuse of children, which is happening very under our noses at 100 times the quantum of what those other kinds of abuse are happening. And why are we shying away from addressing this? Aren't we really failing our children? It's easier to fund things like where the abuser is a stranger, vis-a-vis the abuser being a family member or a known person. And I feel funders need to grow to become comfortable with things that are uncomfortable, because then you are not really serving the purpose for why nonprofits exist. We're here to do the difficult work. All we're asking from you is back it. You don't have to go on the field and do this. You don't have to feel unsafe in tricky situations. It's my team who is compromising safety, going and doing case interventions, managing complex family dynamics, and taking the risk of safety on us. All we're asking to do is support it.
I guess in that you're talking about the fact that there's a definite gap in the funding of things that are need and risk assessed rather than preference chosen. What funders or the funding decision makers find palatable or themselves care about or understand, instead of recognizing that there are a number of things that are extremely and critically underserved and under-addressed. And those are the things where funding should be funneled towards.
And I feel what's seasonal and what's hyped tends to get the spotlight. And look, all issues are important. But I just feel that there needs to be recognition of what's really underserved. Like when climate change became a big thing, you had everybody talking about climate change. When you have livelihoods becoming a big thing, everybody's talking about livelihoods.
Disabilities had their hype cycle in the 80s and the 90s. So it's interesting. And then people imagine that, oh, it's gone now. Nothing's gone.
And I really don't believe nonprofits should do this, but maybe it makes nonprofits so desperate to access the funding that they will package their work to make it sound like it's aligned to climate change work. I've never done it. I will never do it. I'm not going to package in this frivolous way just so that I can have access to that funding. But I do know nonprofits tend to do that. And I feel that they probably do it not just because they want to be there and get that, but they probably feel desperate to do it.
Yeah.
And I want to recognize it's not easy to do this, but maybe they're doing it because they just need the money.
In the end, it's an interesting one about needing the money, right? Because people wonder, well, why are people just trying to raise money? But the reality is that you are representing a demographic or a people you care about that is dependent on you. Once you start that programming, once you start supporting people, now there's a relationship, there's a commitment. That demographic is not able to advocate for its own funding or to address the thing itself. So if you're in the middle, once you've established and there's dependence on you, you almost feel under a lot of pressure to keep that infrastructure running and operating. And I think, again, these are things that is very easy to be lost when you are one or two or three steps removed at the financing end. That the players in the middle, they really feel the pain of failing outcomes at the beneficiary or the recipient, the vulnerable or demographics end. And that can drive them to make a series of short-term beneficial, but long-term extremely unhelpful choices. And nobody's advising them, neither the financiers or nobody else is really saying, look, this is an unwise move.
I mean, people's mission strategy gets affected, right? A donor will come and say, I am funding work only in Uttar Pradesh and West Bengal and Jharkhand. So if you do work over there, I'll give you the money. And then nonprofits feel compelled that, okay, let me start work over there. so that I can get a part of the pot of this money. Now, Arpan usually doesn't respond to such things. And we've always stuck to the geography that we want to work in. But it is these baits that funders put that get nonprofits to dilute their work. It dilutes their strategy because they're feeling compelled to access this pot of money which they are desperate for. So this geography specific demand is also very cumbersome to deal with. And then a final point I want to make for this bit of thing is different kinds of funders expect a different kind of vocabulary to hear. So what I have learned is that Indian based funders expect a different kind of narrative and vocabulary. European kind of funders, slightly more similar. And then you have the American kind of funders who love the numbers, the big data kind of stuff. So adding to all the complexity, there is this another thing that we need to navigate amongst these 20 things is that how do you tailor make your narrative to align to the vocabulary and the narrative that that type of funder wants to hear or understands.
Before we move on from this bit, what I realized is we've talked a lot about that application or selection or that pre-grant process. But I would genuinely be curious, maybe in 2 or 3 points quickly, to just think about your experience once that process is finished. For example, other people I've spoken to have talked about the fact that grants, once awarded, still not sure when they're going to land. There's some complexities there. And then once they've landed, then what happens? Certainly in my cases, I remember the team that then did all the setup, all the diligence, all the agreements, all the verbal confidences, all of those, they hand it over to another team. Now it's the finance team that is doing this and they don't have any context. Sometimes you then find now you've received the money, you're into another life cycle and world of now dealing with completely new people, or somebody leaves who's been your main point of contact and there's been no transition or handover. So the next person comes in and all the assurances are lost. I just want to get a sense of, has anything stood out for you in that later time, and especially as you go through that grant?
Fortunately, no. With trusts and foundations and philanthropists, once the MOU is signed or the agreement is made, we've usually had the money come in as per the timelines that they've shared. It's very rare that it gets delayed. And if there is a delay, they'll let us know that there is a delay, or that they've not been able to get board approvals, or the board meeting got delayed. So they'll keep us posted.
That's an example of that point I'm trying to make, which is their board meeting gets delayed. Now you're being kept posted. You may not feel the pain as much.
But if somebody has tight cash flows, then it would put them in it.
Most nonprofits are operating at a maximum 3-month runway. So it may be unusual to you, but this is the genuine experience of nonprofits. 3 months is about their runway. So if you come back and you delay your board meeting to approve something and hand it over, that nonprofit basically is now still waiting with no cash flow without also being able to raise that same money from another place. I think this is something that a lot of funders don't appreciate, that once you're in a commitment cycle, now double fund for the same thing. There's no hedging. It's not like I can have 3 funders waiting, and then if this one comes through, I tell the other 2 thanks, but no thanks.
People who have tight cash flows would feel this challenge. Fortunately, Arpan hasn't, but I'll tell you where in the context of this have we felt challenged, which was my other section around this particular question we're trying to answer is our experience with working with corporations and CSR companies.
Exactly. CSR is where it's really a challenge.
CSR is where there is a challenge around more of these things, not so much with trust foundations and philanthropists. So with CSR, there are a couple of things, and I've made some points around that. One is that the delay of the tranche can happen because their internal processes, audits, diligence processes haven't happened. Second is this expectation of give us an expense report before even the money hit your account. So they want to know how you are going to use that money line item wise and let them know what that expense report is going to look like even before the tranche has come in. That I find is very unrealistic. Second, their demand on giving fund utilization certificates audited by an external auditor literally yesterday. The expectation is you give it in 2 days. So there is no leeway. There is no communication around, look, by this date, we will need it and please work around it. And even then, it's a very unrealistic expectation. But we work around it because at least we have a heads up that this is something we're going to be asking you for and this is how just our systems are. I think the logistics around managing CSR donors and funding is very tough. You are always on your toes about what's going to come next. The other thing is that they are far more particular about the line item wise expense. So how much did you budget for? How much have you spent? We finally go and make requests around the flexibility of using it in another line item, and they usually agree. But they are far more particular about that. Look, please use it for the thing that you asked the money for. But we've never found a funder who's said, no, you can't use this and give the money back. So the good thing is that nobody's at least asked us to give the money back because it was left unspent. The other part, I think, with corporations has been this whole expectation of keeping overhead costs at 5%, 10%, which is absolutely unrealistic. I don't think that they get the true spirit of the CSR law. The expectation is that they keep their overhead costs while managing CSR at 5%, not the nonprofit. But that expectation is pushed on to us, and it's unrealistic to keep admin overhead costs 5%. So we'll end up getting lesser money from some corporations than our actual costs of delivery of that program because the overhead costs have been cut down. And those negotiations that we have to go through for weeks to agree on something like this just makes you feel very drained and exhausted and disturbed because these are the true costs. And I'm glad that the sector is coming up with reports around pay what it takes. There was a recent report that ARIA Advisory and some of the other funders, I think ATE also supported it, came up with a report for funders to say pay what it takes. Like, look, if this is the cost, pay it. Nobody is going and asking the overhead costs of Colgate toothpaste, but you're buying that, right? So why is this expectation on nonprofits for the services we are providing? And in that report, there's Arpan's case study published as a case study to showcase how Arpan's, to a very large extent, been able to raise money for what it takes to go build that product or that service.
A lot of this comes from the aid sector, where basically money is coming in and that is then being converted into material goods and logistics. So this idea that 20% or 25% or whatever is an unreasonable amount of money to be eaten by the enterprise that is intermediating between goods or whatever that are being received by a beneficiary is where this idea really comes from. And I think people often forget that certainly in the service sector, which is where all developmental nonprofits sit, your entire organization is overhead costs. You're paying for salaries and people are delivering services and paying revenue for those services. So it's a weird game of being forced into playing this 14 or 15% is an acceptable overhead cost, because then it comes down to creative accounting most of the time and what you can move around. Again, this is fine if you are well established and have lots of financing and can pay for expert accountants to play the game. But I think people are forgetting the fact that in any service industry, everything can be considered an overhead, but that's one of the challenges of these things. And capacity versus overheads, again, is a big issue, right? Because you may need a particularly expensive infrastructure to be able to deliver a small service. Now, what do you do for that service to be good? It still needs that infrastructure. You can't deliver that service without infrastructure. So what do we say? Do we just say, because the service is small, we use a crappy infrastructure, and now we have a crappy service with crappy impact? Or do you establish that expensive infrastructure and then you try and grow the service over time? And eventually, at some point in the future, that infrastructure's relative cost becomes a more palatable number. I think, again, that understanding that timelining is an important aspect of funding as well.
With that, already the CSR space is complex because of the compliances that CSR companies have to go through. And we empathize because the laws aren't easy. The compliance expectation is not easy. But I feel that they should reciprocate that empathy to us as well in their expectations of documentation, diligence processes, budgeting exercises, approvals, reporting, fund utilization certificates. The list is long. I feel the relationship was more respectful and more empathetic, and the power dynamics were lesser.
In fairness, it's hard because if you work in that kind of environment, and I've done so your whole life, there's no way to fathom the fact that all of the things you take for granted in your infrastructure, big finance teams, big legal teams, these things are not available.
Exactly. Sometimes the kind of diligence as well at the level of reporting. We have one funder which is now asking for weekly vouchers of expense. I've never had that in 19 years, that we are having to give bank statements marking which is the expense we made from their funding, give weekly vouchers, receipts of the way money is being spent. I feel that's so, I don't know what's the right word.
It's an untenable cost to an enterprise. The cost then of utilizing that money has skyrocketed past any acceptable relative overhead cost, because I think that maybe is also a consideration that says how you provide a fund or some amount of money shouldn't be that the cost of utilizing that money then eats up a good and untenable amount of that money, which is fundamentally then what's happening, because people are spending loads and loads of organizational support time managing all of these things, both time and salaries that are going into it. It's really interesting, right? I think you've come up with a lot of very fascinating details that we certainly haven't covered in other conversations so far, which then leads us on to the exciting part of this conversation. When you go back and you think about all the things that have worked well for you and the things that you really struggled with, what do you think, maybe the top 3 or 4 things that you can think of, how the future of impact funding should look like so that we're really able to eradicate issues? I put it into that context because it's not just about how foundations fund nonprofits, but the real question of the future of funding, I think, should be about how funding eradicates issues. What I mean is that both of them should be operating in some kind of partnership towards an outcome for a demographic or an issue of some description. And the minute you start thinking about it from that lens, then potentially funding the nonprofit is one component of things that a funder might need to either do or fund. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that aspect before we get to the conversation about how you would fund nonprofits.
I feel like the mindset with which people go in and fund social enterprises and the level of risks that they are willing to take and allow for failure or for things not working out, allow for learnings, maybe not even failure. Because I believe if you keep trying, then there are only learnings. If you stop trying, you fail. So can the funder mindset be about allowing learnings and not allowing failure? And if you can come in with that mindset, it would be game changing. Nonprofits would be really able to, with your support, go experiment, go learn, keep checking efficacy, keep redesigning for scale, see which models work, and really be able to go make the impact that everybody signed up for. It's a partnership. How can you make it trusting? How can you make it empowering?
So rather than framing it like a how about we put it into the lens of this is how funding should be?
Should be empowering, learning, and supportive.
So talk to me a little bit about that. So if you could design a fund, what would that look like in the context of these 3 things? You had no limit on money and you had no rules that you needed to work by. How would you give out money?
I would go with the approach of MacKenzie Scott, do trust-based funding and invest large sums of money in one go rather than breaking it into tranches. The additional thing that I would do to MacKenzie Scott funding is keep the door open. If you need more, come to me, make a case of why more, what will you do? And then up to me to give you the next big tranche. So it doesn't end with that one big grant that you've given, but is a more long-term investment that you're willing to make over the years. Right now, her approach is that one big grant and that's it. But I feel that's not enough. I was able to solve 3 things with that big grant, but I have 10 more things to solve and I need continuously more bigger grants. If you think that I am going on the journey in the impact that I have committed to make, are you willing to keep being that co-traveler that every few years you keep the door open for me to come and ask you, can I have an additional $3 million? And this is what I'll be able to solve for with that. And so it's a long-term trajectory that I as a funder would want to have with the nonprofit I support, with these opportunities open, and continue to keep making big bets together and building solutions to solve the problem we've set out to do.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. So for you, the future of funding for it to be truly effective is trust-based. It's about appropriately large sums of money, investing that money in one go rather than in tranches, so organizations can utilize that flexibly and well. And then going back to an earlier piece, you're also referring to freedom to set up reserve funds or endowments.
Absolutely. Use the money for what you want. And if somebody wants to put the entire money into a reserve fund because it helps you to take bigger risks because you know you have money to bank upon, is the biggest thing an entrepreneur needs today. I, as an entrepreneur, have paid a huge price of my emotional, mental, physical well-being over the years, right? How do funders come in to say, we'll help you reduce that. And ask the question, what do you need as an entrepreneur? How do I make sure your well-being is not compromised as much? It will be compromised. There's no question of it, but it does not get compromised as much. And I think that it would be this kind of funding approach that would help it not compromise as much.
In this context, how would you do the selection? What would you do to select appropriately? How would you go about doing that? I want to ask you this because the natural view for a lot of funders might be these people are to give money and there's no conversation about what's the return. So maybe we can put the selection side of it aside and let's talk about the really important bit. If you were giving out money, like say 3 million or large grants, or you're giving people total flexibility, how are you establishing the return on that investment? How are you tracking that so that you feel like that money was used appropriately, especially for the second round?
I would look at how is the organization able to deliver on current commitments and expectations, and how did that first tranche help them and for what purpose? The second time, what is the purpose that they want to ask the second tranche for? Is that justified? Does it make sense? And rely on my gut as much as numbers, because some of these things are beyond numbers and what you see on paper. Is the confidence the entrepreneur is able to bring into me, and things like, is the entrepreneur in this for the long term? Does the entrepreneur have the grit to stay on this journey despite challenges? Is the entrepreneur perseverant enough, passionate enough, convinced enough that this is the way we'll be able to solve the problem? And these are the ways we can try to do so. And some of these might work. Let's go try. Because I feel that it's the same thing. Most big decisions on partnerships are happening during golf. They're not sitting in boardrooms and taking these decisions. And so what is it that's transpiring there? It is the relationship, the confidence that is being built in that person, willing to put in that millions of dollars in you. I feel that confidence is the key thing. If you can generate that confidence, money will come your way. It's worked for me. Because people were able to be confident about me being able to go do what I'm saying. So how can you walk your talk? And how far have you been able to walk your talk?
In the MacKenzie Scott example, what commitments did you make? What was the commitment for that kind of funding in terms of the results? I think that's what I mean.
It was a 3-year plan we give to all our funders. Over the next 3 years, this is what we're looking to do. This is what our budget is looking like. It was nothing different, nothing fancy, done separately. We had no idea about the quantum of funding at all.
What I mean is, in this context, the enterprise or Arpan showcased a series of results that it was aiming for in those 3 years. And that essentially is the commitment you are making. Now what they're doing is we look at what you are stating or committing to achieve in that timeline, and that would have been clear to that funder. And since we work together, we know each other in that sense, those commitments would have been powerful commitments. I guess that's what I was trying to highlight here to some extent.
I don't want to call it a commitment also, because they are not even coming back and checking whether your commitment was fulfilled or not.
But that's different. The point is the commitment is being made.
No, it's not different, because you're only understanding my thinking over there. You're understanding my ability to plan for the next 3 years. You're understanding my desires of what I want to do. But it's not a commitment from a funding space, because you're not asking me for any report. I've not made any promises to you. You're not even expecting a report.
I'm establishing confidence through that process.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It's the confidence. I'm telling you, it's the confidence which is a priority. And the confidence has very, many different things. Am I being thoughtful? Am I being reasonable with my plans? Am I taking too big risks which are unrealistic? Or is it reasonable? All of it are different aspects of confidence building.
What's really interesting about this as a closing point is that fundamentally, this is exactly why you need powerful diligence. Because due diligence is essentially what establishes the confidence that establishes trust. And that is one of the things we always say, gain confidence in your decisions, because that's the key. What I mean is that the confidence is related to your ambition. So you have an ambition level of X, and you're making that ambition level visible to that funder. And then the funder or the third party is establishing confidence in your ability. The fact that they're not then holding you accountable to that doesn't change the fact that you would certainly have made an ambition or a target achievement visible that is powerful and inspiring for that amount of money. And then what you're saying is the good practices here. Similarly with commercial things, once you establish confidence in that team's ability to execute that, then you hand over the money without a whole bunch of unreasonable utilizational rules. Certainly in the case of this, you're not really looking for end reporting. You've done your diligence up front that says, we're confident this organization will use it well. Now we provide the money, and then you go and do your best. I don't want that point to be lost, that you would have made visible a target achievement, something that you were aiming to achieve in that time. And that's the thing that you have to judge your confidence against. When we talk about the future of funding, I just wanted to bring that into the design that you put there. Otherwise, it just reads like we should just believe in people and give them money. But actually, that sense of belief is based on whether I believe you can do a certain thing. Does that make sense? What I mean is that you have to check to see whether you believe in the person, whether you believe in the team, whether you believe in their achievement.
This is the point I'm making around that gut as well. What does your gut tell you to do? Because it's not just a numbers thing. I don't think people make big bets with just numbers. You make it with that gut that tells you, look, this guy or this woman is going to deliver what she's saying. I get that feeling. I need to go do that. So I'm just bringing in this feeling, this gut aspect, because I do think that that's an important one. And it's important to recognize for funders to have that.
I think this point is an important point maybe we can close on, which is in this relationship, did the main decision makers get a chance to talk to you directly? Or did you only talk to intermediaries in the flow?
Only intermediaries.
Interesting, right? Because that often tends to be where the gap lies.
And that's true for many big philanthropists as well as corporations. We don't land up presenting to the committee and the decision makers. And I repeatedly ask for the opportunities. Can I present? Give me just 10 minutes.
Would you do that differently?
Yes, I would ask people to present to me directly, because only then can I use my gut as well. Otherwise, I'm relying on information that these intermediary people are giving me, and it's not necessarily giving me the big picture unless I'm only doing a tick box exercise, which I don't think is the way we should be investing in people.
So for you, the future of funding really lies in funders taking the time to establish and build confidence in the organizations and the organizational leaders that they are looking to fund. Then once they've established that confidence, to trust them and to give them the leeway and the flexibility to really shine, to do their best from that point forward. And ideally with rolling potential of at least 10-year timelines. That's a great model or a vision for how funding should look like. From the mouth of a 19-year entrepreneur. You've done really well in that time, beaten many of the challenges you talked about, and you get past them and beat them. I'm sure that the model that you suggest is, in fact, a workable and potentially powerful insight for anyone that is thinking of establishing funds.
Yeah, it would be amazing. Imagine if I had the opportunity to go back to MacKenzie Scott's team and say, look, can I get an additional 3-4 million? And this is what I'm going to do, because the first tranche you gave me served these of my needs. Now I need to fulfill these needs. And are you willing to make a big bet? So big bets are game changing in the impact space. The small things are never catalytic. It's the big bets that are catalytic. Truly.
That's a great point to end on, the big bets. All right, Pooja. Thank you so much. It's so kind of you to make all this time. Super insightful. I learned a lot, and I'm sure so will anybody else that listens to this. We will do our best to draw out as many of these insights as possible.
Thank you so much for doing this. So happy to have had this conversation with you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.